to the Rich Report, a podcast with news and information on the world of big data. Today my guest is from a company called Lucid Imagination. We have Grant Ingersoll. He's the chief scientist for the company. So Grant, welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Rich. Glad to be here.
Well, great. I'm intrigued by the name of your company. Why don't we go into your slides and we'll follow that with a Q&A.
Sure, sounds good. So what I'd like to talk about is something that has been on my mind, I guess, and on the company's mind for quite some time, and that is how do we better enable scalable search, discovery, and analytics. This is an area of, I think, emerging interest for a lot of companies, and I think brings some practical aspects to the big data question. So I think in terms of the opportunity, we all know the opportunity that data presents. Presumably the listeners of this are pretty familiar with the fact that, go pick whatever pundit you want, fill in the blanks around data growth in the next X number of days, months, years, etc., and you have a picture of what big data is. And then, of course, if you dig a little bit deeper, everybody's talking about a lot of this data is unstructured. I put that in quotes. And or put multi-structured there because I don't particularly like the name unstructured. Unstructured often refers to text, and as we all know as speakers of languages, that there is definitely a lot of structure in there. Perhaps just the computers aren't so good at understanding it just yet, or we're not so good at representing it in ways that computers can consume. The other part of the opportunity, I think, is the second bullet here is, in many ways we live in this age of data paranoia or data opportunity that kind of go hand in hand, right? Is you see a lot of people spending a lot of money and time and effort around big data, and there's this common sense that, well, what if I don't collect it all? What if I'm missing something? What if I can't store it? What if I can't secure it? And then, can I really afford to do this? And can I afford not to? What if my competition is doing this and I'm not? And then at the end of the day, I think the thing that hits home for most people is, what if I can't make sense of it? I've got all this data, but, what good is it doing me? So you've got to have this broader sense of the opportunity and the broader sense of what kind of returns you're going to get out of it. So, for me, when I look at the big data space, there's a whole lot of premises out there right now. There's also a whole lot of hype. There's also a lot of promises being made. And if you look at tools like Hadoop, et cetera, they'll make the premises that you can do large-scale data collection and storage. The promise, I think, there is fulfilled. Same for data loss, with perhaps the exception of some of the name node single points of failure, if you're talking Hadoop specifically. Long-term storage, affordability, relatively speaking, I think most people would say tools like Hadoop, et cetera, are more affordable than commercial or proprietary solutions there. And then last but not least, you're also starting to see this trend around the leveraging and employment of people with titles like data scientist or chief data officer, any of those kinds of things. And the idea here is that this big data is driving some new science that's delivering deeper insights into what people are actually doing in the real world. And to me, that's still a little bit of a question mark in terms of defining out those areas. But I think one of the things that helps answer that question is bringing some practical sides to this, and to me that comes back to looking at what our user needs and what our business needs when it comes to understanding all of this data. And the way I think that resonates with me about understanding this data is by thinking of it in terms of search, discovery, and analytics. From the user side of things, you want that real-time ad hoc access to content that search provides you. And then you want tools that help discover and or prioritize that content. So, there's these other notions of serendipity and then also prioritization. I think for many of us, you can relate to these kinds of things on a personal level and just dealing with email plus, all of your social streams like Facebook, et cetera, right? All of those things are very much time-based access, right? We look at our inboxes, we look at our walls, and whatever's on top is what we go and interact with the most, right? But then we often, I think, have this notion that we're missing things in the background, right? And so you want some tools. I think we all would like tools that help us not miss those things. And so that's where I think the discovery and the analytics pieces come in. What can we do as computer scientists, as engineers, as programmers to help people not miss those things while still getting at what's important? And for me, the way this resonates is through this notion of search, discovery, and analytics, or SDA. And, as the picture there illuminates, I think this is a virtuous cycle where as people do search and discovery on their content, they get more insight into what's going on. The analytics then drives that understanding of, from a business side, of what users are doing with the content, and then we can feed that back into the system as well as we can extract out of it what's important for us as business people to do in order to better understand our content, where to make more investments, where we can make more profit, all of those kinds of things. So in terms of what you need for this, for if you're a developer or if you're an IT organization or a business wanting to build out on SDA, I think there's a number of things. Of course, you need fast, efficient, scalable search. I'll talk a little bit more about open source options there. You need, of course, large-scale, cost-effective storage and computational capabilities. The choice du jour these days is Hadoop, but the idea here is that you're able to take in very large amounts of this data and do analysis of all of it. You're able to sample from it. In some cases, you may want to work with smaller bits of it in memory. And then last but not least, since we're talking semi-structured content, we need to be able to bring in things like natural language processing and machine learning tools that scale so that we can really start to recognize the patterns in our content and start to identify important things like perhaps named entities, or we want to be able to classify content into our taxonomy, et cetera. I think probably a lot of the listeners to your podcast here are pretty familiar with the example use cases. Just to highlight a few, I think, everybody, when they talk big data, one of the first things that comes to mind is social media monitoring, basically keeping track of what everybody's saying all the time around brands or products, et cetera. For me, other ones that are interesting, this notion of dark data. You see this a lot in government and in large organizations where they just, they've either done a lot of mergers and acquisitions, or they just, they produce a whole lot of content, and the organization as a whole just does not understand what's in that content. They can't search it. It's locked away. It's in archives, and so they just don't have a good sense of what's going on in there. Financial. I've seen this in a few use cases with customers, being able to better understand what customers are doing, what the risks are, what the opportunities. Across medical, being able to do things like drug discovery as you're doing drug development, drug discovery, or even just clinical trials, being able to understand what the research is saying, what the clinical trials are saying, what the field usage is saying, being able to combine all of those different kinds of content into something that makes sense for organization or researchers, et cetera. Last but not least, e-commerce. E-commerce, I think, in many ways is driving a lot of the technology for this big data because the analytics are very real to them. They often are very metrics driven as to what's selling and what's not, and so they're constantly doing experiments across their catalogs to see what they can better sell to their customers. So even though their product catalog may not be very large, many large online stores, it's maybe 10, 20, 50 million items. But when you cross that with a very large volume of users, you get some really interesting big data, I think. So the nice thing there is it's very metric driven, and so you have big opportunity there for this SDA capability. For us then, what this translates to us as a company at Lucid Imagination is we've just announced as a product what we're calling LucidWorks Big Data. The idea is we want to bring some of these ideas into a platform that then enables people to deal with their content and better understand what their users are doing. And I'd like to just emphasize, that last part, the users is to me very important. This notion of user interactions, that really to me is where the opportunity lies in making search and discovery that much better, because you're learning from what users are doing. You're looking at their clicks, their ratings, their reviews. All of those things give you a holistic view that can then be overlaid with your content to get a better understanding of, again, depending on your vertical, whether you're going to make more money off it, you're going to save money, you're just going to understand your risks better, your opportunities, etc. So for us, what does LucidWorks Big Data look like? Here's a little bit on our architecture. I like to start with the computation and storage layer. To me, that's the operating system. This is all about bringing together the capabilities of Hadoop, HBase, and LucidWorks Enterprise. LucidWorks Enterprise, just for the listeners, is essentially Apache Solr plus some layers on top of it for doing things like data acquisition and management, et cetera, around the open source Apache Solr project. So this operating system layer is all about making sure the data is in the right place at the right time for the layers that sit on top of it. So you want to make sure that the content is in your index when it needs to be searched. That's what the shards area there is. You want to make sure that the logs that capture all of the information that's happening as users interact with that content, you want to make sure that's available for these large-scale analysis jobs that one is typically running when they're trying to understand, who clicked on what, when, and where. And then you need something like HDFS or a distributed file system for, essentially being able to store all of this stuff at scale and over time, right? And then, essentially at a computation layer, the, LucidWorks and HBase both give you things like real-time access to the content, whereas Hadoop gives you, of course, something like MapReduce where you can do this large-scale computation across the data, right? And then moving up a layer to the search, discovery, and analytics layer, this is all about, what tools can I bring to bear in terms of things like machine learning, in terms of crunching the data, in terms of, statistical analysis of the data, clustering, et cetera, so that I can, better expose out to the users via the APIs at the top layer the kinds of things that they're interested in. And so what we aim to do is give you a number of those things out of the box, and then also still let you go in and write your own MapReduce jobs if you want, or your own pig scripts, or integrate in with your own statistical packages. What you see on the right-hand side is essentially a lot of the glue that binds all this together. It's not shown there, but we mostly use Apache Zookeeper for being aware of who's up and who's down and what their configuration state is. The bottom layer is essentially all about provisioning and monitoring and the kind of the operational aspect of running what amounts to a pretty complex system with a lot of moving parts. Right now, we also offer this up on Amazon and cloud hosted, but can bring it on-premise too. Then the left-hand side is all about data acquisition. How do I get my content in? Getting content into Hadoop, for instance, is non-trivial. If you've got a lot of small files or a lot of files like Office documents, et cetera, you need to be able to collapse those down into larger files that are better suited for the kinds of things that Hadoop does. And then you also need to, of course, be able to get them into your search index. So providing a number of tools that help with data acquisition is, I think, part and parcel to any architecture like this. At the top level, we expose all of this out through a single set of APIs that give access to the various systems in here, as well as the higher level capabilities that we provide. So there's access to like the workflows that get data from Hadoop into LucidWorks. There's APIs for kicking off analytics jobs that will go and calculate some of the metrics that people might be interested in, et cetera. So that's a high level view of the architecture. Some of the key features, I think I covered a lot of these already, but essentially, at the operating system level, bringing together the goodness of Hadoop with the goodness of Solr and LucidWorks, and then building on top of that the analytics capabilities, the discovery insights that people often want when they're building search-based applications. Wrap that all up into a full stack. We take care of provisioning. We take care of monitoring, all of that. If you choose, we can do we host this in the cloud for you initially, but then you can also, we'll be able to bring it on-premise in the near future. Next slide. Just covering real quickly some of the APIs. At the search level, essentially, as I said, taking care of all of the capability, giving you all the capabilities of LucidWorks and Solr. This involves being able to do bulk indexing as well as near real-time indexing. If you're not that familiar with Solr, one of the things Solr has is distributed indexing and search capabilities. We call that collective functionality Solr Cloud. We take advantage of that here in LucidWorks Big Data. We define a number of workflows for essentially doing things like ETL, extract, transform, load of your data, as well as log processing, clustering, and a number of other things. We've got administration capabilities. We've got a number of analytics and machine learning capabilities built in right now, and then we're looking to expand out on those. Most of our analytics right now are geared around better understanding your relevancy, better understanding how users are interacting with your content, but we do see moving on to broader capabilities around analytics. Underneath the hood, I think I've covered a lot of this. For those people who are familiar with Solr, some of the details around what's going on in terms of our Solr setup may be of interest to how people can get a better sense of how Solr scales out to meet the challenge of being able to ingest whatever Hadoop throws at it. On the engine side, this is just kind of a rundown of what we do in terms of building out the glue that binds all of this together. A little bit more underneath the hood in terms of the backend services that we use to really drive a lot of this. Obviously, Hadoop is a key part of this in terms of leveraging it for things like ETL, being able to use something like Apache Pig on top of it to be able to chunk through logs, really reduce down our development time, and also give users a kind of a higher level access to MapReduce without necessarily having to know Java and all the MapReduce stuff. If listeners aren't familiar, Apache Mahout is an Apache project geared towards machine learning. It's all about scalable machine learning algorithms. It primarily is focused around what we call the 3 C's: collaborative filtering, i.e. recommendations, classification, and clustering. There's a number of other things in it as well, but those are the primary areas we focus on, and we're all about making those scale. So in many cases, we run on top of Hadoop, but not in all cases. And then I think probably if you've been in the big data business for a while, you've heard about HBase. We use that as a column family. I mentioned we use Pig. Zookeeper gives us all these primitives for essentially knowing who's up and who's down and what their state is in. Netflix has actually donated a layer above Zookeeper called Curator that takes a lot of the Zookeeper recipes and just gives you them as code, so you don't have to go and build out those things. So for instance, we use that for service discovery in our system, who's available, where they're available, all of those things. But they also have other recipes for things like distributed locks, barriers, etc. And then we also use some pub/sub mechanisms for getting logs out of LucidWorks and into HDFS so that we can run our large-scale jobs on those. So that's kind of a tour of underneath the hood. Transitioning then into things we're looking at down the road. As I mentioned earlier, most of our approach around analytics right now is from the search and discovery outwards. So we're primarily geared around how do we give people who are building search-based applications more insight into what users are doing with their content. But of course, I think in the big data space, there's general interest in analytics as a whole, and not necessarily just around search. And so we are looking at more capabilities there. A lot of the themes there center around relevance. How are we making sure that users are getting their most relevant content? Data quality, of course, is always an issue. So understanding where you have data quality issues, and then how all of these things can be, I think, fed into helping in the discovery process. How do we give users more of that serendipitous insight into what's in their content while still, of course, giving them the ad hoc access? Since we're talking big data, I think it goes without saying that you need machine learning capabilities to do this. So especially things like classification models, being able to essentially create prediction models as to what your content belongs to, what your users are asking. All of those are key components of building out effective systems these days. And then likewise, since we're talking unstructured, more NLP capabilities we're looking at right now, things like named entity recognition, being able to find people, places, things in your data, and then exposing them out in more structured ways. The last bullet really is geared towards people who are already using Lucene and Solr. This basically has to do with being able to bring more of these analytics in-house. So you can do already in Solr things like faceting and some basic statistics around what's in the content, but I think we need to flesh out a lot more details there and a lot more capabilities in terms of general computation around what's in the index. So being able to, for instance, easily calculate co-occurrences of terms in the index across the whole index, not just, particular result sets. So those are some of the things we're thinking about in terms of the road ahead. There's obviously a lot more that can be done here, and we're constantly evaluating what makes sense for us to invest in as a company. So I think that's about it. Just leave with some contact information. Happy to take questions or insights from people, and of course, the business side of me and the company is always interested in people who are interested in trying out the big data beta and giving us feedback on that. So with that, I think hand it back to Rich, and happy to answer some questions.
Well, thanks for that, Grant. I'm curious about the value add of Lucid Imagination. Are you guys kind of acting as an integrator between these various open source pieces and filling in the gaps? Is that a fair description of what you do?
So I think Lucid can be described at a couple of levels. Our core business has always been around Lucene and Solr. Sometimes you could equate to us to, what MySQL does for that database or what Red Hat does for Linux, et cetera. We try to do that for Lucene and Solr. So, basically have a company that provides training, support, knowledge transfer, et cetera, around Lucene and Solr. We then also, with our LucidWorks platform, ship a product on top of it that we think brings a lot of value and takes away, it does a number of things that we've seen people have to do in terms of building out Solr-based applications or Lucene-based applications. We add in things like, we have connectors for SharePoint and databases and file system crawling and like Microsoft Exchange, et cetera. We also provide, like as I mentioned, web-based administration and UI around it. So then what big data, I think, gets at is kind of this evolution of what we've seen with another number of customers as well as in the community as a whole, the search community, as well as our own vision around where we think, the search space belongs or the search space is headed, as well as, in many ways, reinserting search into the big data equation. We've been watching the big data bandwagon for a while, if you will, and search has been missing. And search in many ways was the original big data use case. It certainly was for Hadoop as a Lucene project and at Google as well. I think the evolution here for us is that it's not just about, using Hadoop to build the indexes, but it's about using Hadoop in close concert with search to do a whole lot more analysis, not just building the index, but understanding how users are interacting with it, et cetera. So at one level, the big data product here is, as you mentioned, the glue around it, the integration around it. But I do think it's also an evolution to this notion of search discovery and analytics, which is much more geared towards the types of problems I think people are trying to solve with big data, especially as it relates to dealing with lots of content and lots of users interacting with that content.
So yeah, I was intrigued by you were describing, how it's a user-centric kind of model, and I was thinking it sounded like Google itself, right? I mean, where the whole internet is the database, and yet the search results are tailored to me. I'm getting different results than you would if you typed in the same term because I have different feeds on the social media, etc. How does that work for your product?
Yeah, I mean, I won't be so bold as to compare ourselves to Google because that's just asking for trouble on the marketing side. But I do think what we do want to enable is the kinds of things that Google is trying to get at the internet scale, is being able to do that within the enterprise and within across a variety of different data sources that people have access to. I mean, and what we've seen in a number of places in practice is that when you have the right tools combined with your domain knowledge about your content and the types of things you do as a company, you can bring a whole lot more to the table in terms of relevance, right? And so, this is, I think, a number of reasons why over the years open source search through things like Lucene and Solr have gotten more and more popular, such that I think today they're easily the most popular search capabilities on the planet, other than internet search, is because people, they don't want to go write the core algorithms themselves, but they want to be able to bring their expertise around what they do as a business on top of search. And so in many ways, SDA formalizes a lot of the tools and techniques that I think people are commonly doing when they're building out these search-based applications. And then, of course, the big data aspect to it, of course, is that we need to just do this on a lot larger sets of data than we ever have in the past. So, could you go build out internet scale applications with this? Yes, I think you can. Are we going to go compete with Google, or are you going to go compete with Google? I mean, that's up to, I personally am not in that space, but if somebody, wants to go build out, I think these kinds of tools are the things that one needs in order to start with that process. But of course, there's a whole lot more in terms of the operational side of it and data centers and sophistication around the machine learning and understanding the users, and the fact that you also have to have, one of the big advantages Google has is they've got all of those users coming to the table and voting essentially, second by second as to what's important, right?
Yeah. So kind of a wrap-up question here, Grant. What kind of capabilities, far-reaching wise, are users asking you guys for?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting evolution in the company. I'm actually one of the co-founders. In the early days, we spent a whole lot of our time around, how do I stand up Solr? How do I, get it running, get it, make sure it's tuned right, et cetera. And a lot of it was in terms of like the speed and performance aspects of it, right? Whereas I think now, all of those things are a given. Solr pretty much just works for most people. There's things that you can tweak here and there for particularly high volume that one would want to do, but they are much more sophisticated around search. They want deeper insight. They want more discovery capabilities. They want to be able to do recommendations, upsells, cross-sells, all of those kinds of things. But they're doing them in a search-centric way. So how do all of those things relate to what you're doing with search, right? And so those are the kinds of problems they're asking about. They're asking hard questions about relevance. How do I get more relevant content? Given that we all, live in a sea of spam, right? Or what seems to be spam. How do you get the nuggets to the user that are useful to them at the right point in time, right? And that's where you've got to have, I think, a combination of all of these techniques. You need that ad hoc search that we all know and love via tools like Google and we're all trained on. But you also need tools that can, in the background, do kind of the chunking through the large amounts of the data in order to, come up with new discoveries and new insights and new analysis of that content so that you don't have to sift it through as much. Right, but still very much human in the loop, I think, which is key, right?
Well, that's great. Well, Grant Ingersoll, I want to thank you once again for coming on the show today.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you and your listeners.
Terrific. Okay, folks, that's it for the Rich Report. Stay tuned for more news and information on the world of big data.